Madame de Lafayette was a French noblewoman who lived an incredible life. She was chosen by destiny to marry a man who became a hero of both France and America. One may say that she could also claim that title, given her courage, passion, dedication, and thoughtful actions that distinguished her life. Adrienne de Noailles was born in 1759 in Paris to a family of noble origins. Her parents were the Duke and the Duchess d'Aillon. Her father, Jean-François de Noailles, was close to the royal family and the court of Louis XV, and later to that of Louis XVI. Adrienne spent her childhood and adolescence together with her four sisters, Louise, Clotilde, Pauline, and Rosalie, in the family's sumptuous mansion. Their mother, the Duchess d'Aillon, was determined to educate her daughters according to their own individuality, with emphasis on the art of conversation, reading literature, and poetry. Adrienne was sharp-witted, and her mother taught her to think logically and based on facts. She was also educated to be a good Christian, and her religious beliefs would guide her throughout her life. Her childhood was joyful and spent together with her sisters, being lovingly adored by their parents. When Adrienne was 12, her parents began considering their daughter's options for getting married. A young handsome man enrolled at the military academy of Versailles, called Gilbert de Monthier, Marquis de Lafayette, would soon need a wife. He was of noble origins and the owner of impressive wealth. The dashing red-haired man had been brought up by his aunts after his mother's death when he was 11. Given his young age and being the owner of such vast wealth, seemed to make Adrienne's mother doubt that the marriage between her very young daughter, who was only 15 years old, and Gilbert, who was only 17, would be a wise choice. Adrienne's father was happy though with the prospect of his daughter getting married to Gilbert de Lafayette, and after a few months of reluctance, the Duchess was also convinced and gave her consent. The young couple celebrated their wedding in April 1774. Adrienne was happy with Gilbert and was impressed by his character, brave, serious, and kind. The following year they had their first child, a daughter called Henriette. In a short time their love and affection for each other would gradually grow to the point where Adrienne was completely in love with Lafayette. Soon the life of Madame de Lafayette would change when her husband decided to sail to America to join the war effort for the American War of Independence. Everyone tried to convince Gilbert not to go, but it was a futile effort. He was born to fight for liberty. Although Adrienne was heartbroken to be without her husband, she was proud and supportive of him. He was a free spirit and always ready to uphold his principles of freedom wherever he happened to be. On his way to America, Gilbert was writing to his wife saying, "Whilst defending the liberty I adore, I shall enjoy perfect freedom myself. I but offer my service to that interesting republic from motives of the purest kind, unmixed with ambition or private views. Her happiness and my glory are my only incentives to the task. I hope that for my sake you will become a good American, for that feeling is worthy of every noble heart." Shortly after receiving this letter from her husband, Adrienne gave birth to the couple's second daughter, named Anastasie. It was difficult for Adrienne, a young mother, to live without her husband, but Lafayette never stopped writing to her, expressing his thoughts and feelings for her and his young family, saying in one of his letters, "Embrace most tenderly my Henriette. May I add, embrace our children? The father of those poor children is a wanderer, but he is nevertheless a good honest man, a good father, warmly attached to his family, and a good husband also, for he loves his wife most tenderly." Sadly, whilst he was in America, Henriette died before she reached 2 years old, Lafayette being unaware of it. Soon he sent another letter, expressing his anguish and concerns about not having received any news from Adrienne. He said, "I have no resource left in me, my love, but to write and write again, without even hoping that my letters will ever reach you, and I endeavour to console myself by the pleasure of conversing with you, for the disappointment and anguish of not receiving one single line from France. It is impossible to describe to you how completely my heart is torn by anxiety and fear. If I could only know at this moment where you are and what you are doing." Although Adrienne kept sending him letters, he wrote in November 1777 to say that "I am separated from the reality of my happiness by 2,000 leagues, an immense ocean and villainous English vessels. Those wretched vessels make me very unhappy. One letter only have I yet received from you, my love. The others have been lost or taken, and are probably at the bottom of the sea. I must consider our enemy the cause of this dreadful loss, for I am certain you do not neglect to write to me from every port." The impatient Lafayette returned to France at the beginning of February of 1779 and surprised Adrienne and her family by turning up unannounced. Adrienne was relieved to see him in front of her eyes. All the worries in the world had disappeared. At the end of that year, their son George was born on the 24th of December. They named him George Washington in a sign of respect for the American general who was a friend and mentor to the young Lafayette. Adrienne's happiness was short-lived though, with Lafayette announcing he would return to America. The young wife, who was only 20 years old at that time, had to endure another separation. His duty came first. Almost 2 years passed, and when the campaign in Virginia was over, Lafayette sailed to France. On the 21st of January 1782, he arrived in Paris in his characteristic fashion, out of the blue. Queen Marie Antoinette came to see Adrienne and complimented her on her husband's victory in America. Madame de Lafayette could not be prouder of her husband. She was just overjoyed to have him back in her life. In September that year, their last child was born, and they named her Marie Antoinette Virginie to show respect for the Queen and in memory of the Virginia campaign. Planning for the future, the happy family decided to buy a house for themselves and live like they always wanted. In the spring of 1783, the couple travelled to Auvergne, to the Château de Chavagnac. It was a chance for Adrienne to see where Lafayette was born and where he grew up. Madame de Chavagnac, the aunt of Lafayette, was extremely happy to welcome them. By the following summer, the restless Gilbert announced that he would go to America. In the meantime, Madame de Lafayette dedicated her time to educating the children. Their father returned in January 1785, a sigh of relief for his wife. Politically, France would enter the pre-revolutionary phase. Adrienne's husband believed in adopting reforms for the governing of France, such as social justice and a liberal political government. Not surprisingly, the freedom lover Lafayette favoured the abolition of the privileges of the old regime in favour of democratic freedom, but supportive of a constitutional monarchy. Whilst Adrienne's mother rejected the liberal ideas of her son-in-law, fearing it would lead to frightful consequences, Adrienne was torn between the two, and she chose wholeheartedly to support her husband. In July 1789, Lafayette got involved in the political affairs of his country by joining the National Assembly, presenting a draft for the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, and after the fall of the Bastille, being elected Commander-in-Chief of the National Guards in Paris. After the events that shook France to the core, when the new Constitution of 1791 was approved, there was renewed hope that the events of the previous years and the King's arrest at Varennes were just that, past events. People thought a new era of political stability had been achieved. Adrienne was also one of those hoping that her husband's involvement in politics was over. and they would just live their lives peacefully. Yet the euphoria of that moment was brief. In October that year, Adrienne and Lafayette made plans and left Paris to settle at the Château de Chavagnac. On their way to Auvergne, Lafayette was cheered by many people, delighted to see the famous man. For Adrienne, it was the first time in her married life that she could just live quietly after all those difficult years. Lafayette also enjoyed the life in the countryside and started making plans to restore his chateau. His wife could not be more pleased with this newfound way of life. No one realized that in a short little while their lives would change irreversibly. Plans, dreams, hopes would just never come true. Life would be turned upside down. By December, Lafayette had to leave his wife and children again and went to serve in the army. The war with Austria broke in the spring of 1792. Adrienne's mother and her sister Louise, who had been visiting the family at the Château de Chavagnac, also had to leave and return to Paris. When they said their goodbyes, they did not suspect that it would be for the last time. By the summer, Paris was in turmoil. Worried about what was happening, Adrienne was just awaiting news from Lafayette. On the 28th of June, 1792, shocked by the turn of the events, he travelled to Paris and delivered a blistering attack on the Jacobins for the lawlessness caused. Realizing that the king's life was in danger, Lafayette offered his assistance to the royal family within his army, but he was refused. It was a dangerous moment for Lafayette and his family. Accused of being a royalist and a traitor of the revolution, he had no choice but to leave France. When he crossed the border, he was detained by the Austrians and imprisoned. Meanwhile, at Chavagnac, Adrienne was just wondering about her husband's safety and whereabouts. When she received news from her sister that he had been able to escape France, she was relieved. What she didn't know was that he had been detained. Soon, Adrienne realized that her children's lives were in danger and sent them to safety to a residence away from Chavagnac. Yet, her 15-year-old daughter Anastasie came back with her sister Virginie and the governess to be with their mother. Adrienne, Anastasie and Madame de Chavagnac were arrested, and later, after Adrienne wrote letters to request their release, they were put under house arrest at Chavagnac, unable to travel. When Adrienne received news that her husband had been detained in Prussia, the only thing on her mind was to join him. But how? All her moves were monitored. She wrote to Washington, asking for his help, saying how Lafayette tried to get to England before he was detained. The plan was for Adrienne and the children to meet him there and then go to America. Months passed and help couldn't come. Not getting a reply, she wrote again to Washington, expressing her confusion about his silence. Although he had replied to her letters, he did not specifically ask for Lafayette's release. She frantically wrote letters to all the people who had any authority to decide, and also to the King of Prussia, asking for the release of her husband. After Louis XVI was tried and executed, Madame de Lafayette was getting worried, as she was separated from the rest of her family. What could happen to them? An order was issued for all those involved in helping in any way the Lafayette family to be arrested. In October 1793, Adrienne's mother, her sister and her grandmother were arrested. Adrienne was also arrested a month later. Missing her mother, Anastasie was smuggled into the prison to see Adrienne a few weeks later. When Madame de Lafayette learned that her mother, her grandmother and her sister were transferred to Luxembourg prison, she nearly fainted. She knew that they were just days away from death by guillotine. The only thing she could do was praying. In May 1794, the door of her prison room opened and she heard the word Paris. she would be transferred to La Force prison. The Revolutionary Committee was to decide her fate. From there she was transferred to a different prison. Looking out the window, she would see carts full of people transported to the scaffold. Day by day, she was just waiting for her name to be called. To be able to survive, she was just thinking about her children and her husband. Tears and prayers. Her children were left without their father's house, which had been sold, and they were fed by the residents of the village. No one knew what would happen to them. 2 months later, Adrienne's mother, grandmother and sister were guillotined. When she later learned how they died, Adrienne suffered unbearable pain. When the turbulent days of the revolutionary regime ended, Madame de Lafayette was released at the end of January 1795 upon the request of the American representative in France. After her release, she had no time to waste. She would soon make arrangements to go and look for Lafayette. But firstly, she sent her son to America to be safely living and studying there. Madame de Lafayette wrote a letter to Washington asking him to protect her son. George Lafayette was well looked after by his American friends. She then asked for help with getting passports and organized her departure from France. She went to Auvergne to meet her daughters there, and they all left in September 1795. Adrienne traveled under the name Autier and was helped by the American representative in Hamburg to go to Vienna to be seen by the emperor. Since Lafayette would not be released from prison, her only wish was to be allowed to stay with him and their daughters in the same prison. Once the permission granted, she left Vienna, and on the 3rd of October 1795, she finally got to Olmütz, where Lafayette had been detained for 3 years. Her prayers had been listened to. The family would be soon reunited. When Adrienne and her daughters were led into the prison room where Lafayette was being detained, they were shocked to see how much he had changed. He was being harshly treated after he once attempted to escape. By that time he had lost all his hope of ever seeing his family again. Yet his brave and devoted wife made that possible against all odds. Being together gave them strength to carry on day by day, but the harsh imprisonment conditions took a heavy toll on their health. Their rooms were damp with no sunlight getting in and dirty. Madame de Lafayette did everything she could to keep the family alive by writing letters to her banker to send money to pay for food. Reflecting on the past events, Adrienne wrote a biography about her dear mother, writing on the margins of a book using a toothpick. By February the following year, Adrienne's health was steadily declining. Lafayette begged her to write to the emperor to ask for permission to travel to Vienna to see a doctor. After 2 months, she received news that she would be allowed to travel for health assistance, but no hope of being able to return to the prison. She chose to die rather than being separated again from her husband. Adrienne was only allowed to see a doctor a few minutes a day. Napoleon's victories over the Austrians gave him the authority to demand the release of all the prisoners at Olmütz. It had been 5 years of misery for Lafayette. Adrienne was barely alive when they were released in September 1797. The whole family was shaken by their ordeal. By December, they were settled in Holstein, where they could be joined by friends and relatives. Their daughter Anastasie got married in May the following year to the delight of her parents. George returned from America to join the family. Sadly, Madame de Lafayette was so ill that she was barely able to attend the wedding, but she was the happiest woman on earth to see her family reunited. Day by day, she slowly started feeling better. Being the only member of her family allowed to travel to France, Adrienne had to return and start recovering the possessions and properties of her family. Did she have any more strength left in her? It seemed she did. After some time spent in Paris, Adrienne travelled to Auvergne, where Madame de Chavagnac was waiting for her. The following year, her sisters travelled to Holland and visited Adrienne and Lafayette, who were still living there. Although Adrienne was only 40 years old, when her sisters came to see her, they found her looking older than she really was and physically changed beyond recognition. Years of suffering and struggle had affected their sister enormously. Eager to go back to France, Lafayette was eventually allowed to return. Adrienne went to see Napoleon and spoke on her husband's behalf. He was allowed to stay, provided he would keep a low profile. For the last years of her life, Adrienne lived with Lafayette and their family at the Château de la Grange. George got married there in the summer of 1802, and the following year Virginie also got married, to the delight of her parents. The health of Madame de Lafayette never actually improved, and she was getting closer to the end of her short life. She died surrounded by her loving family. She was only 48 years old. Lafayette was deeply affected by her death. He had lost his adorable wife, his devoted partner, and his guardian angel.